on its likely user population.
I was thinking of user burden.
That works too.
So let's put, just for now, put user before burden. So what we would do would be to amend the language as it was already agreed upon to add and user burden in line 108. Do I have that correct? Peter?
I think not. I think it was then, if you're going to do that, you should take out for its likely user population. No? I would, then I wouldn't have user twice.
Correct. That's redundant. You're correct.
Just burden.
For its likely user population.
Take out user. Burden of the ECMS for its likely user population. Is that correct?
On its likely user.
On its likely user population.
No.
No,
The others don't.
the others need 4.
It's 4's fine. The others are 4.
Pardon?
And then to get rid of the brackets, that's that part of the.
Yeah, the bracketed language would go if that amendment carries. Yes, Alice.
Yeah, someone suggested this before, but I'm having trouble with the very last phrase in there saying exceptions to mandatory electronic filing. That's kind of, it's redundant, and I would take out mandatory and possibly exceptions to electronic filing procedures or something like that. Because it's obviously not mandatory if we're having exceptions to it.
Thoughts on that one?
Over here.
Judge McCarthy.
I would propose simplifying the whole thing. I think what we're trying to get at is we're encouraging non-agency individuals to file electronically, but because of due process concerns, we want to carve out an exception. So, I mean, I would think that simplified language that leaves the first sentence and then says, and create exceptions where appropriate, without specifying the considerations that come into play, would give the agencies enough discretion to do that.
Connor, you want to clean this up for us? You're the committee chair.
My personal view is the amendments where we were prior to Judge McCarthy were a good compromise and made sense. So that's where I would land.
All right. Does anybody wish to move Judge McCarthy's? Is anybody in support of Judge McCarthy's amendment? Is there any voting? Yes.
I move it.
Is there a second?
Is there a second? All right. We will not take that amendment up. So now what we're deciding on is whether the changes in lines 108 through 110 should be made. Am I correct? Excuse me, 107 through 109, and the most significant of which is the inclusion of the word burden. Is that right? Any objection to Nadine, please?
I apologize. Nadine Mancini. I'm having a reaction to the word burden. The way it reads now, suitability and usability are, positive sounding things, and burden sounds like we're already assuming it's a burden. Potential burden, any burden.
Emily.
Difficulty? That might be better. The way it reads, it just sounds like we know there will be a burden. We're anticipating a burden.
Nadine, what are you proposing?
I think difficulty would be fine. The first thought I had was potential or any.
Is there a preference for difficulty over burden or burden over difficulty?
Does any of this add to suitability and?
Allison Zeeve, please.
I'm just wondering what burdens, potential burdens or difficulties wouldn't be covered by suitability and usability?
Anything else on this? Bridget?
I'd agree with Allison's point. I think it's fine to strike and burden. We were just trying to work with the prior language, which has been removed now. We'd be
Connor?
happy to pull it back.
Well, I guess my thought was usability to some may mean accessibility in the sense of visual impairment, et cetera. Burden is sort of capturing those who may not have the resources for the internet. So I guess personally, I would get rid of suitability and keep usability and burden. But I don't know. I don't have a strong view.
Let's take suitability off. Let's leave suitability in there. Is any objection to that? And the question is whether we include burden. Is that fair? In the interest of getting this done? Yes? Connor, you move the amendment to include and burden in line 108, subject to any revisions by the appropriate revisions by the Committee on Style. Yes? Is there a second? Yes. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay, the amendment carries. And are there any additional amendments that any members wish to offer at this time? There will be no other time. I shouldn't have said that. So, Bob?
So I have two minor, well, hopefully minor points to make that perhaps someone would want to offer an amendment. In 4B, it starts on 102. That in 104 it says, and whether procedural rules are different if a case file is electronic than on paper. That to me is confusing, maybe just because it says are different. Because the beginning of the provision says you're going to decide whether the one or the other, and then it says whether they are different. And I just think that doesn't really help people what I think we're talking about. So I would suggest that we say, leaving the first clause up to record of the case on 104, and then whether procedural rules such as filing deadlines and service requirements should be modified or clarified, period. And then take out the rest of that, including the if it's electronic rather than on paper.
I think it should be modified or clarified.
I'm sorry, filing methods and deadlines.
Roxanne?
I think it's a good addition. I think that it might be simpler to simply say, leave the language as it was, and whether procedural rules should be amended if a case file is electronic rather than on paper. The should be amended is because there may be a whole host of ways in which it needs to change other than the ones that are specified.
Connor, do you have any thoughts on that on behalf of the committee with respect to that proposed change?
Well, Gavin and I were just thinking of ending with should be different, rather than presuming an amendment, but just should be different. Whether procedural rules should be different if a case file is electronic rather than on paper.
That's the current language.
No, it says are different. It says are different is the current language.
Yeah. My only point is to give some concrete examples there, which I think are pretty, easily understood and have been in cases where electronic case management has come into play. Service can be by email instead of by registered mail or whatever. So I just think the recommendation is a little bit more useful to people coming in cold to have those examples than to say whether the procedural rules should be different.
What are you proposing?
The language that's up there. Filing deadline should be modified or clarified.
Emily, please.
Emily Bremer, public member. I think right now we've got a redundancy because we're saying at the top, consider the implications of an ECMS on an agency's procedural rules, and then saying again later whether procedural rules should be modified or clarified. Maybe a simpler way of accomplishing this, and I like the idea of including examples, would be to consider, whether the adoption of an ECMS requires changes or modifications to the agency's procedural rules. And I mean this at the top, like not there, but at the beginning of the sentence. So whether the adoption of an ECMS requires changes or modifications of an agency's procedural rules, including to address issues such as whether the paper or electronic version, blah, 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 or whether filing, changes to filing methods or deadlines, if that makes sense. I think the language is it's a little rough, but. Changes or modifications might be redundant.
Let's just take out changes or just say modifications. Consider whether the option of an ECMS requires modifications of an agency's procedural rules. What about the clause including to address such issues as? Does that need to be included? And if it does, then we need to fill in the blanks.
The blank is on 105.
Pardon?
The blank goes to 105, right?
Yeah.
Including issues such as.
I say, you're right, I'm sorry, you're right, Allison.
Well, I think she's saying to address such issues as whether, and then you go to line 106 where it says the paper or electronic version. Isn't that your suggestion?
I just want to include both the examples of whether the paper or electronic version will constitute the official record and whether filing methods and deadlines need to be changed. I don't really care how that happens. I would just include those two examples in whatever way makes most sense, and I would be happy to leave that to the Committee on Style. I think the important point is to include a couple of examples of things that might have to change.
Let's get it up there in some form or another, though.
It's filing methods and deadlines.
This could be cleaned up a little bit, but by the Committee on Style, but otherwise, how does that sit with you, Connor?
I think it's fine.
All right, we have amendments about 12 levels deep here. Why don't we take, we have a motion to amend the 4B in accordance with what appears on the screen. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, the amendment is adopted. Are there any, without objection, the debate is extended by 5 additional minutes. Are there any other amendments on this recommendation?
One more.
Yes.
One issue that occurred to me reading this, because this has been faced increasingly in recent years, is the impact of a lapse in funding. Because when you have an electronic system and your website has to go dark because the government is shut down, it creates a variety of issues. And I just think that mentioning that somehow as something that agencies should consider how to handle it, which our agency did, would be worth doing. And the only place that I saw kind of easily to fit this in is on line 118. This is a management structure capable of, and then this talks about restoring normal operations. And number 2 is eliminating recurring problems and minimize the impact of problems that cannot be prevented, such as a lapse in funding. We just flagged for agencies that that's something they need to take into account when they're setting up a system and modifying procedural rules.
Connor?
I guess my view is that general issue is addressed at lines 97 through 99, which is the introduction to recommendation 4. And, you know, I think the lapse in funding is an issue that could affect almost anything an agency does. I don't know that we need to call it out here in particular. I think what's at 97 through 99 is sufficient.
Is there a motion in furtherance of Bob's comment? No. Any further, do we have any further proposed amendments? No. Let me just raise a small point myself here. Paragraph 4C, consider whether to require non-agency individuals to file claims, complaints, or petitions. Should it say something after petitions and other papers or anything of that sort? That doesn't exhaust the types of filings that might be made in any agency adjudication.
I think we even discussed that committee and may have meant to include that.
Okay, any objection to that change? So that change is made in the absence of any objection. Are there any other amendments? Yes. Let's move to a final vote on the recommendation as amended. All those in favor say yay. Yay. Opposed, nay. The yeas have it, and the recommendation is adopted. Thank you. So our business is finished for today. Before adjourning, please join me in thanking the conference staff. And I'd like to thank in particular 3 staff members from whom you've not heard and perhaps not seen too much during the plenary session, and too often get more grief perhaps than gratitude. Chris, our new IT specialist. Chris Hammerly. Danielle Williams, I don't know where Danielle is. And Talia Hutchinson, especially. Thank you, Talia. Please reserve December 13th and 14th, do I have those dates right, of this year for the 70th plenary session. And those dates are subject to, among other things, and especially council approval. With my sincere thanks to all of you and best wishes for an enjoyable, restful, and rewarding summer, I adjourn the 69th plenary session of the Administrative Conference. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gavin. Thanks for...
Yeah. If you guys want a longer line, go ahead. I wanted this to be short. I'm having so dear. There's a lot of restaurants in here.
Yeah, I'm on vacation next year. Exactly.
Oh, yeah. All right.
My first plenary, but I went. There is a subject. Okay. I'll come back. Join if it's okay. I would like to have you.
That was not.
Thanks so much again. Thanks so much. I remember that. I know that. I was predicting Burton was going to Well, we're gonna go with the Spectre alternative. That wasn't happening. But I was focused.
Yeah.
Well, let us know. Go ahead. So we just talking about the.
So were there other examples?
No, it wasn't just about that. It was on the survey.
So, I mean, are there a lot of other examples? Reports actually.
So it had to do with speed.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly.
We did talk about, there was partial consideration of one of the agencies did a double record-keeping system during their transition where they maintained identical copies both electronically and in paper. But they were able to do it because they had a smaller caseload, whereas in other agencies that would have been cost prohibitive. But that's very important. I think a lot of agencies don't know how to get from A to B. I think the important piece, is to stay on top of the implementation. We had a lot of agencies in the room at the committee here that had yet to engage in this process to the extent that we I think that's going to be a resource.
But the priorities might be.
Oh, really?
I know Roxanne is eager to do that because she'd actually given presentations, I think, to both DOJ and EEOC on implementing electronic case.
Yeah, once you get the message, you really need a workshop to put things in place. So about guiding them.
Great. Also, it's good to meet you, and thank you again for providing your feedback on the one bill. I do think I think we're working really hard to develop on that. We jumped at the opportunity to say, oh, if you would like feedback, we'd be happy to give it. We haven't heard anything since. My sense is that they might have been overwhelmed by the amount of comments, constructive criticism. So they might be going back to the drawing board, which I think is a good thing. But I think they have a lot more to think about thanks to your comments. For sure. Yeah. Great, thank you so much.
We have to make it mandatory.
Well, first, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
We usually publish our reports online. Is that something that we're allowed to do? Like, what are we reading the contract?
Yeah, so we're published. We published it. Let me ask.
Yeah, if you want, you can get back to me over email, because I know it's public on the internet, and sometimes when courts do research on the topic, we can also publish it in our site, and then they'll find it. But I wanted to check with you first.
That probably depends on the contract. So let's go walk over and see. We can talk to Harry right now. He can probably give us.
Okay, what I do recall about the contract, that it said help promote the report.
Okay.
So maybe in that line it makes sense. But yeah, I wanted to consult first.
Yeah, I don't want to speculate as to.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm still new here to this agency myself, so I don't know how to practice it.
Now I'm going to Destin, Florida. Every summer, my whole family. I will not be. See you later, Frank.
I was actually.
You know, it's great.
I've noticed that some of the government representatives.
Norma Rose.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of conceptualizing something. So, yeah, we're kind of leaving something like that, unless if we could conceivable way. But there are
tons. I mean, they are, yes, for a very small number of people in New York.
Was that a choice?
No. It agrees. I mean, telework is a weird thing. You know, we think of telework as once a week or something like that. These people work. I don't think I've ever.
They're never.
They work at least Carolina.
Right, but there was one that the driver to leave, the Anthony was
I always thought it was just.
Well,
some agencies don't ask for that.
Really?
Even though it's really
More.
So no, I'm very, very familiar
Yeah.
with the argument.
They have to.
well, let me know if you have thoughts.
Yeah, we'll definitely be in touch on the interpretation.
Anyways,